They woke to sirens that didn't belong to earthquakes or drills. Tokyo's morning light was still thin, the tea not yet poured, when shadows slid across rooftops. Low, too low for anything the city had practiced for. Shop shutters rattled. A clerk on a bicycle stopped and stared at the unthinkable. American stars on the wings of twin-engine bombers were only reconnaissance seaplanes ever dared. The first concussions came a breath later, sharp, contained, more insult than apocalypse, and yet the sound stretched farther than any blast could, all the way into rooms where men in uniforms measured certainty for a living. Across a cold, gray Pacific, that certainty had begun to fracture at dawn on a different deck. The carrier Hornet rode a mean sea like a reluctant horse, its top deck made stranger by a row of Army B-25 Mitchells lashed nose to tail, their props tight as fists. Carrier crews in blue and Army crews in leather moved among them with the choreography of a plan that wasn't supposed to be possible. Take medium bombers, land birds with long legs, and fling them off a flight deck meant for smaller, lighter things. At the front of that improbable parade, James Harold Doolittle, aviator, engineer, gambler with a slide rule, walked the line and checked the wind as if it could be negotiated. They had wanted to launch closer, deep in the blind spot of Japanese coastal watchers. Fate sent fishing boats instead, picket craft with radios and bad luck. The American task force cut them down, but not fast enough to silence the message that mattered. Enemy carriers east. Admiral Halsey didn't wait for arguments or calmer water. He turned his face into spray and gave the only order that fit the day. Launch now or not at all. The deck became a cliff. The ocean fell away. One by one the Mitchells rolled, engines howling, tires clinging to the last painted lines as if paint could be gravity. Each plane hit the wind, staggered, and flew because physics and nerve agreed to pretend the deck was longer than it was. There was no coming back. The plan had always been to bomb and then skip like stones toward China, fueled by hope and a tailwind. Launching early meant less fuel, more ocean, and a whisper in every cockpit that said, "Make it anyway." Tokyo felt the low pass before it believed it. Anti-aircraft gunners scrambled and shouted bearings that ran faster than their hands. The B-25s came in clever, under the comfortable ceiling of doctrine, and tossed their small packages into a city that had been told the war lived far away. A factory roof buckled, a warehouse shed glass, a government office collected a new pattern of holes to explain. Fire crews swarmed and did their work. Damage reports began to sound like reassurance. The numbers would later be tidy, survivable, but numbers didn't capture the way a population turned its face toward the sky and found a new shape there.
In the Imperial compound, the air went tight. The Navy had promised a wall of water no enemy could cross without losing its name. The Army had promised a wall of discipline no enemy could slip through without being noticed a prefecture away. Both promises now had dents. If American bombers could leap off a ship and touch Tokyo, what else could they do that physics and doctrine said they couldn't? Who had counted the enemy's will as a resource? Who had guessed that humiliation travels faster than any fleet? Out at altitude, where the world narrows to instruments and fuel gauges, every crew learned the same lesson at a different minute. China was farther than a map suggests. Winds shifted, the day aged, hands adjusted the mixture levers like prayers. Over coastal hills, the weather turned thick and hostile. Pilots dropped to find ground that wouldn't appear and raised to escape mountains that did. Some crews bailed out into night and rain. Others aimed for fields that weren't there. One limped to Vladivostok and discovered neutrality could feel like a locked door. A few put down in China and stepped into a different war. villagers and guerrillas whisking them away from Japanese patrols at the price of terrible reprisals that would haunt even a successful mission. Back in Tokyo, the papers worked fast. The headline had to tell two truths at once. Damage limited, spirit unshaken. America dared, therefore America existed closer than policy allowed. In officers' meetings, the lists of what to do next began to look like fate pretending to be choice. Widen the perimeter, smash the enemy's carriers, draw the decisive battle now, on our terms. Midway wasn't on the calendar yet, but the ink had been uncapped. On Hornet, the deck crews swept, the sea closed over the morning's noise, and Halsey's ships turned away like a punch withdrawn late. They had escorted a gesture that behaved like strategy. Doolittle, convinced he'd led brave men to a one-way mission with minimal material effect, offered his resignation in a sentence as straight as a runway. The country refused to let him quit and handed him a medal instead, not for the tons dropped, but for the pounds lifted from a nation's chest. The raid's real blast radius wasn't measured in craters. It ran through boardrooms where steel quotas were set a notch higher, through assembly lines that added a shift without being asked, through mailrooms where mothers read the news and breathed deeper for the first time since December. It ran, too, through Japanese planning rooms, altering maps with the invisible ink of embarrassment and urgency. A city had been touched, an ego bruised, a timetable moved forward against better judgment. And in the simple human scale where wars are felt, a boy in Tokyo traced a plane in the air with a finger and asked his father a question no poster could answer. How did they get here? The father didn't know yet that the better question had already been asked across the ocean. If we can do this, what else can we dare? The day had begun with the impossible made loud and ended with a conclusion quieter and more dangerous. America was only beginning to fight, and now everyone knew it.
Night fell on questions the raid had thrown into daylight, and both sides began answering them in motion. In Tokyo, the maps came out again, not as ornaments, but as accusations. If American twin-engine bombers could leap from a carrier and touch the capital, then the ocean's moat was narrower than pride had measured. Staff officers widened circles with pencil compasses. Home defense belts pushed outward. Picket lines thickened. Fighter squadrons reassigned to stand guard over cities that had believed themselves untouchable. The cheapest response was steel on paper. The real response was risk. Force the decisive carrier battle now before those audacious Americans turned a stunt into a habit. Across the water, on the mess decks, and in factory lunchrooms, the raid did a different kind of arithmetic. It converted dread into deadlines. The country had been holding its breath since December. Now it exhaled into production. A shift supervisor who taped a gold star beside a time clock added a third shift. A welder who had learned her craft 9 weeks prior ran beads like she was tracing a promise. The felt truth was simple. If we can reach Tokyo today, we can reach anything tomorrow, provided we build, train, and keep the schedule. The crews who had flown the mission were meanwhile discovering that victory and survival exist on separate ledgers. Most drifted down into storm and darkness over China, silk canopies snapping open over ridgelines, hard landings in terraced fields, sudden kindness in the form of villagers who spirited strangers away before patrols could find them. Aid had a price. Reprisals came, brutal and wide, and the men who were hidden carried the weight of that knowledge for the rest of their lives. A few aircraft found strips by miracle. One crossed into the wrong safety, landing in the Soviet Far East, to be politely interned by a neutrality that felt like a locked room with the window open. Doolittle himself, certain he would be court-martialed for losing every bomber he'd led, walked into Washington to a different verdict. A medal placed in his hand and a nation's morale hung around his neck like a second ribbon.
He waved away the talk of heroics with the engineer's reflex to reduce things to steps, strip weight, add tankage, practice short deck runs until impossible is just a longer checklist. The glamour lay elsewhere. The lesson, that boldness, rehearsed until it looks ordinary, can move the world, stayed with the people who needed it. Inside Japanese planning rooms, humiliation sharpened into a timeline. The perimeter must be pushed so far east that no American carrier could get within reach again. The American carriers themselves must be drawn out and destroyed. Charts crowded with names, Midway, the Aleutians, points on a line that promised to restore the physics of the Empire's comfort. Distance, warning, control. The raid had been militarily small and psychologically huge. The answer would reverse that proportion. A vast operation would be mounted to heal a wound measured in headlines. Meanwhile, the American task force that had flung the Army's medium bombers off a deck turned back into the weather, engines humming like secrets kept. On Hornet, sailors picked gear out of scuppers and returned the ship to its usual grammar of fighters and scouts. On Enterprise, the escorts read sea and sky and watched for the enemy's reply. No one on those decks could see over the curve of the world to the conference tables, where their morning would soon be cited as Exhibit A for haste.
In the weeks between shock and countershock, small stories kept the charge alive. A mechanic in California passed along a trick he'd learned prepping the Mitchells, how to shave an extra mile from a fuel burn with mixture and prop. A young pilot in training traced the departure path with his finger over a photograph of a crowded deck and understood that audacity, when well planned, doesn't look like chaos, it looks like mutual trust timed to a second. In grocery lines and streetcars, people spoke the raid's 3 essential facts with the cadence of a prayer. They went, they hit, they came home, or tried. The tried mattered as much as the hit. When reports of the damage reached American desks, the numbers were indeed small. Warehouses pocked, a factory roof peeled back, and administrative buildings scarred. The critics said, "All that for this?" The country answered, "All that for this feeling, the one that refills lungs and order books both." Strategy is not just tons of explosives, it is where you put the weight of attention. For a few days, Japan had to look inward and ask unflattering questions. For a few months, America looked outward with a steadier hand. In villages along the Chinese coast, the aftermath wrote itself in grief and grit. The rescued aviators moved west by candle, mule, and miracle, kept alive by people who had nothing spare and gave it anyway. Years later, the survivors would return that debt with scholarships and funds and quiet visits. The ledger between strangers can be balanced, if imperfectly, by lives that remember. By early summer, pencils that had circled possibilities began to ink orders. Ships sortied, pilots briefed. A trap was baited far out on the blue. In a way no one could yet articulate, the flight of 16 medium bombers had nudged a fleet into harm's geometry. Pride had been pricked, timing tilted. A battle that might have waited came on in haste. And scattered around America, newly minted crews climbed into freshly riveted aircraft and practiced short takeoffs on long runways, because nothing teaches like audacity that works. A sergeant in a classroom held up a small wooden sight, a simple aiming device, light and crude, and told his class why a complicated bomb sight had stayed home. The room chuckled. The point landed. Sometimes the tool you need is the one you can afford to lose. The raid's last echo wasn't a sound at all, but a habit. When something looks impossible, ask if you're counting correctly. When an enemy believes distance is armor, turn distance into timing. When fear steals your breath, hand it back a plan. Somewhere in Tokyo, a father still searched the sky with his son and found only clouds. Somewhere in Ohio, a foreman rang a bell and another shift put on gloves. The sky would fill again soon, this time over a lonely atoll most Americans hadn't heard of. The road there ran straight through a morning when 16 bombers rose from a ship and taught 2 empires what the rest of the war would feel like.
Dawn over the central Pacific looked harmless, an inkwash of blues, a horizon that pretended to be empty. Japanese reconnaissance pilots traced arcs across that emptiness with the dutiful boredom of men who had never been surprised by nothing. Their reports stacked up like reassuring receipts. No enemy at bearing such and such, seas moderate, clouds thin. Far behind them, a task force shaped by humiliation and urgency slid toward a point on the map that sounded more postcard than battlefield. Midway. On flagship bridges, officers reviewed elegant diagrams where American carriers were bait, where surprise would be Japanese again by right of doctrine, where the ocean was a chessboard, not a weather system with opinions. The Doolittle raid had written a note in the margin of those diagrams. Fight now. Pride sharpened pencils. Calendars tightened into timetables. Intelligence estimates leaned toward preference. A victory meant to restore physics, distance, warning, control, was scripted before the sea got a vote. Midway's little atoll, meanwhile, behaved like a factory with sand for walls. Seabees and island hands stacked bombs in neat pyramids under nets, dragged steel matting into place, argued about windsocks and won or lost to gusts. A Marine squadron that had trained on clapped-out wildcats took possession of a handful of new birds and broke in their engines with the quiet terror of people who know the job won't wait for mastery. On the waterline, a PBY Catalina blinked a lamp at nothing in particular and recorded the reply, silence, as data. Out where the horizon widened, American carriers behaved like guilty secrets. Pilots rehearsed launch orders in their heads. Deck crews counted and recounted arming pins because counting is a kind of prayer. A torpedo squadron commander, tired eyes, jaw set, passed his finger along a Mark 13 skin as if touch could fix reputation. Everyone had heard torpedo rumors. Depth keeping bad, exploders fickle, a weapon built to fail politely. But war is what you do with the tools you have when time won't let you wait for the ones you want. Japan reached first, as planned. The sky over Midway filled with lines that curved into attack. Sirens turned the atoll into a diagram you could hear. Marine pilots clawed up into the sun and met sleek enemies their manuals had drawn but never fully explained. The fight looked, from the ground, like punctuation marks thrown by angry gods. Bombs walked across sand and runway. Fuel tanks found the law of unfortunate attraction. A hangar took a philosophy lesson from high explosive. Midway bent, didn't break, radioed like a professional. Attacked, standing, send regards. That message traveled farther than its watts suggested. Over the horizon, American carriers angled into the script's margin. The Japanese strike groups, busy landing and refitting, forced their decks into that dangerous in-between. Planes recovering, planes rearming, planes being told to switch from island bombs to armor-piercing for the carriers that must be out there somewhere. Hangar decks became workshops of indecision, crates half-opened, dollies lined with the wrong kind of destruction, fuel hoses laid out like bad omens. A PBY found what everyone was guessing at, enemy force, heading, and the report ran down radio nets like a lit fuse. American squadrons launched in packets, not in a parade. Timing would conspire and bless, but no one knew that yet. Torpedo planes went first, or alone, depending on whose clock you carried. They flew low because doctrine and physics said low, and they flew into a meat grinder because the zero said no to anything that didn't respect energy and altitude. The men in those slow, stubborn aircraft kept going anyway. A straight line traced by people who understand that sometimes your job is to make the next person's job possible. They died. One after another, torpedo bombers flamed, broke, kissed the sea with unromantic finality. A few got weapons away, most got history's quiet thanks. Above them, fighters that should have been looking outward looked down, drawn by the feast at wave-top height. The Japanese combat air patrol sank to finish brave men who shouldn't have had a chance, and in doing so, they cleared the vertical for chance to arrive wearing a different uniform.
It did. Dive bombers, late by some clocks, right on time by the wars, fell through a patchwork of cloud and sun and found, by luck and by the mathematics of a fleet mid-refit, what every briefing had begged for: carriers with their decks crowded, fuel lines laid, bombs out where they could be tripped over. Altimeters unwound, pilot eyes watered, and the ocean rose at a gratifying speed. The first bombs struck as if aimed by all the lost torpedo crew's last intentions. Metal learned new shapes, fire learned new paths. 3 carriers took mortal wounds in a handful of minutes that felt like a verdict being read without flourish. Back aboard American decks, men allowed themselves one breath. Then they looked for the 4th carrier because the sea rarely writes scenes with clean act breaks. It would take another search, more luck, more grim precision. The Japanese still had skill enough to hurt, and they did. A U.S. flight deck would turn into a brief hell of fire and decision. Damaged crews, trained to move like a single practical thought, carved the problem down to solvable parts. The ship lived. The fight swung. In Tokyo, a chill moved through rooms that had glowed with restored confidence. The day's first bad report was an error, the second an exaggeration, the third a shape that wouldn't be smoothed. The arithmetic of carriers, tonnage, planes, crews, doctrine reduced itself to an unforgiving fraction. The perimeter imagined after the Doolittle raid broke not at its edge, but at its logic. You can extend a moat, but you can't make it a law. An enemy who learns fast and dares on schedule will find you. Back in American factories, the Midway headlines didn't announce an end, they published a pace. Rivets hit faster, not sloppier. Training syllabi shortened without turning into superstition. A torpedo board met in rooms where chairs had memory and decided that failure would be treated as an engineering problem, not a secret. The victory didn't invite rest, it demanded process. Doolittle, who had once offered to resign for leading men into history on a path with no return runway, read the Midway communiques with the complicated relief of a man who knows his small audacity had helped bait a larger enemy into a fight he couldn't afford. He kept his medal in a drawer and his schedule on the wall. The country liked the drawer better than the wall. The wall is what wins wars. In China, families lit incense for reprisals they had not deserved. Some of the men they had saved wrote letters to widows decades later, words that moved too slowly for grief, but arrived anyway because promises, even late, do work. The raid's shadow included debts you can't repay, only honor by refusing to forget. And somewhere in the Pacific, a young American pilot strapped into a dive bomber and touched the lucky charm tucked under the instrument panel, a folded clipping about 16 Army planes lifting off a carrier deck into impossible wind. He didn't need the charm, not really. He needed the sequence it implied: plan, rehearse, launch, adapt, finish, learn. He rolled inverted, the world flipped into sense, the target steadied, and the bomb left his life into another's. When he pulled out, lungs burning, he thought, not of glory, but of checklists that keep courage from wasting itself. War would go on, remorseless and inventive. Islands with names that sounded like lullabies would become synonyms for attrition. Europe would grind, factories would feed frontiers until the words enough and done finally shook hands. But the hinge had turned. A city that had woken to sirens now measured its nights differently. A navy that had set out to erase a humiliation returned with a hole where certainty had lived. If the Doolittle raid had been a sentence written across an enemy's sky, "We can reach you," Midway was the reply that made the sentence binding. "We can stop you." Between them runs the thread that ties audacity to outcome, the quiet labor of people who turned shocks into schedules and courage into choreography. That's what the rest of the war would look like from above. Not miracles, but appointments kept at speed until the extraordinary felt inevitable.
They called it a runway, but for weeks it behaved more like a dare carved into coral. On Guadalcanal, the steel matting buckled under heat and the sudden weight of hope. Men in dusty greens named the strip Henderson Field after a pilot who hadn't come back from Midway, and then set about making sure other pilots would. The first landings felt like contraband. SBDs dropping in with their wheels sighing, wildcats scraping sky off their bellies, ground crews sprinting out with chalks and buckets and a confidence 2 meals ahead of reality. The sign by the revetments didn't say Air Force. It said CACTUS, and what it lacked in ceremony it made up in stubbornness. Every afternoon, the horizon developed a migraine. The Tokyo Express coming down the slot, destroyers fast as rumors, bringing men and shells and the certainty that night would belong to someone else. By day, the CACTUS Air Force bit pieces off that certainty. Dive bombers hitting transports yawing through spume, P-400s and F-4Fs clawing at bombers that came in just high enough to dare them. Fuel arrived in drums that sounded like promises when you thumped them. Ammunition came by guesses, by miracles, by boats that pretended surf was a gentle suggestion. The strip ate everything and asked for more. The men fed it with sleep they couldn't spare and jokes that kept their hands steady. At sea, cruisers and destroyers fought knife fights in black water. Names like Savo, Cape Esperance, Tassafaronga scratched themselves onto the war the way coral scratches hulls, sudden, unforgiving, unforgettable. Radar began to turn night into a tactical condition rather than a superstition. Torpedoes, ours reluctant and theirs vicious, wrote the difference between theory and obituary. Each dawn looked like a balance sheet. Ships traded, men missing, a runway still usable, a perimeter that hadn't been kicked into the sea. It wasn't glorious. It was continuous. Back home, factories found their pace and then exceeded it. A woman in a bandana and a man with a lunch pail learned to switch stations without dropping quality. A plant manager discovered the motivational power of a clock that started on time and a parts bin that never lied. Liberty ships slid into water so often that launches began to feel like punctuation. Shermans left railheads in 2s and 10s and then hundreds. They weren't the best tank on any single metric, except the metric that matters when wars stretch. They arrived, they ran, they were not precious. The country's genius wasn't a secret weapon. It was the decision to make enough into an art form. Japan, still brave and still skilled, began to feel the physics turn against it. Oil had to travel farther. Pilots had fewer hours to learn what experience had once given as a birthright. Carriers that had been doctrine-made flesh now needed planes and men faster than an island empire could afford. The Doolittle insult and the Midway fracture flowed together into a pressure that never let up. Choices narrowed, gambles grew longer. Victories, when they came, cost more than they bought. Under the ocean, another argument sharpened. American submarines, early war orphans with bad torpedoes and better crews, pounded nails into the Empire's floorboards until you could hear it groan. Fix the exploders, fix the depth, fix the doctrine. By late 43, the fixes held, and the tonnage graph that planners used to hide from began to slope in a way you could feel on a Japanese factory floor. A freighter that never arrives is a machine you never build, is a plane that never takes off, is a pilot who trains on hope instead of hours. The War of Tuesdays, the one that decides whether soup is hot and trains are on time, tipped toward America and stayed there. The vocabulary of the fight changed register. Guadalcanal became New Georgia, became Bougainville, each a rehearsal for the next landing's better choreography. Higgins boats kissing sand, CBs turning swamp into road, LSTs disgorging steel like a factory with tides. Carrier task forces learned to replenish underway, so the ocean became a highway instead of a moat. Air superiority stopped being a prayer and became a schedule. Patrols stacked at altitudes with names, fighters on the cap, while bombers took a number and a vector. The enemy still hit back, hard, often, and with courage, but each blow now had to cross a longer distance and a thicker layer of American routine. In rooms without windows, pencils did damage. Codebreakers nursed coffee and slid strings of kana and numerals into places that made sense. A convoy rerouted here, a trap baited there, a squadron put where the enemy would be tomorrow. Intelligence stopped trying to predict the future and started arranging it, inch by inch. The miracle wasn't omniscience.
It was 1,000 correct guesses landing close enough to look like destiny from the outside. And always there was the ledger you couldn't see on a map. Men learning how to come home to a world that kept pace with them. A letter wrote itself on a bunk in a hot tent. Dear Dad, it's not that the enemy is less brave, it's that we're getting better at boring things. We have a way of making today turn into tomorrow the way it's supposed to. He folded it around a photograph of a runway that looked like a scar and a promise, and hoped the censor would let both through. When the Navy finally stepped into the Marianas and turned the sky into a harvest, Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the papers crowed with a cruelty that hides relief. The truth behind the headline lived in training logs and production charts. You don't shoot down hundreds of enemy aircraft in a day because your trigger finger is lucky. You do it because your radar sees farther. Your pilots rotate through simulators and syllabus flights like clockwork. Your ships carry the fuel and ammunition to keep the sky crowded with your intentions. The extraordinary becomes repeatable, and then the enemy's math stops working. By the time B-29s took altitude over places that had once been dots on a schoolroom globe, the earlier lesson, the one that began with 16 Mitchells jumping a deck, had become doctrine with better range. Audacity remained. It wore a different airframe. Logistics had grown its own wings. Island airstrips built on schedule, tankers parking in oceanic gas stations, maintenance lines that turned monsters into daily drivers. The war that had started with the question, can we even reach them, now asked a quieter one, how reliably can we return? In Tokyo, the arc bent from pride to pragmatism to the empty cupboard of options. Ministers talked of negotiating positions in rooms that smelled like paper and fatigue. Admirals stared at maps that no longer obeyed. The home islands learned sirens as seasons. Somewhere, a father who had once told his son that oceans are walls began to frame the lesson differently. Walls work until someone makes doors. The story settles, finally, not in a victory parade, but in a warehouse with a concrete floor. A forklift backs neatly, a pallet slides where it belongs, a clipboard receives a tick in the right box. A ship leaves on time with trucks already scheduled for its wake. A pilot checks a list, and a mechanic wipes a wrench, and a cook stirs without hurrying, because hungry men are coming when the clock says, not when luck allows. The loud parts of the war, explosions, headlines, the high notes of courage, earned their place. The quiet parts kept it. Look back along the chain. A raid that said we can reach you, a battle that said we can stop you, a campaign that proved we can keep going. Between them runs the same current, turning daring into routine until the extraordinary seems inevitable. That's how the Pacific shrank, and the Empire's Tuesday failed, and another Tuesday, somewhere stateside, kept all its appointments.
The ocean's last arguments were the ugliest because they were the closest. On a map, Iwo Jima was a pimple between bombers and home. In practice, it was a cinder block thrown into the Pacific's gears. The plan sounded clinical. Take the airfields, deny the warning radar, give wounded B-29s a place to fall that wasn't water. But the island had other ideas. The Marines hit black sand that behaved like ball bearings, climbed a volcano that stored rage in tunnels, and learned that courage sometimes looks like inches taken with a shovel. When Suribachi finally wore the flag like a bandage, the quieter photo the papers didn't print was a superfortress limping out of a winter sky to touch down on a runway that hadn't existed last week. One bomber saved, then 10, then hundreds, each a crew, each a letter that got delivered. Strategy looks like a statue for a day. Logistics keeps landing after the camera leaves. Iwo Jima removed even the last pretense of clean edges. The Navy built a floating city and then tried to hold it while the sky turned into a blade. Kamikaze waves didn't negotiate. They arrived with the finality of arithmetic. On destroyer decks, damage control teams became a country's pulse. Hoses, foam, axes, hands that knew where the next valve lived without thinking. LSTs became triage wards and machine shops again, as if the war were testing whether improvisation could be institutionalized. It could. A ship that should have died at noon answered roll call at dusk because a dozen small drills had been practiced on boring Wednesdays.
Under the surface, the blockade finished its slow work. Submariners who had spent the early war arguing with their torpedoes now argued with tonnage and won. Oil that didn't arrive became factories that didn't run, became pilots who trained on metaphors. Freight trains sat where rails were intact because locomotives were scrap or out of steam. Barges hugged coasts like exhausted swimmers and then stopped hugging because there was nothing left to carry. The empire shrank to the size of whatever could be pulled by a bicycle. Above it all, B-29s began to write in fire. At altitude, the jet stream mocked precision. At night, lower and uglier, the targets turned from points to neighborhoods. The burn maps were drawn with rulers and ash. It is possible to admire a schedule without admiring what it delivers. It is possible, too, to notice that the precision was, in a different key, the same discipline that had kept shelves full and convoys moving. The arithmetic that sustains life can be turned against it when a country decides finish is the kindest available verb. Inside conference rooms that smelled of sweat and paper, men read graphs that refused to flatter. Radar pickets at sea were being chewed to splinters even as they saved carriers. Industry at home could replace steel, but not time. A navy that had wrapped the home islands in an iron traffic pattern began to speak in the future tense about invasion, and the casualty tables everyone tried not to touch lay on the table anyway, like a dare. Meanwhile, a program that had lived behind fences and chalkboards reached for a different lever. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The syllables moved through the world with the weight of decisions that would never be light. And then the broadcasts changed register. Swords weren't exactly beaten into plowshares, they were stacked, cataloged, made boring by design. In Tokyo Bay, aboard a battleship that had started the war as an argument for deterrence and ended it as a desk, signatures turned noise into cease. Civilians stared at the sky without flinching for the first time in years. On airfields that had trained boys into pilots, into names on lists, the engines cooled and the clipboards got out one last time to smother chaos with procedure. Inventory, handover, mothball. Go home.
Going home is its own campaign. The same choreography that had moved men out now had to move them back without breaking them or the places they returned to. Demobilization orders read like poems to patients. Trains on timetables, points accumulated, ships loaded by theater and promised dates. In a dockside warehouse, a clerk who had balanced crates of ammunition in 1942 now balanced expectations in 1945, and got yelled at less often than you'd think because he posted the schedule and kept it. Factories unlearned war the way you unlearn a limp, slowly, with effort, with ghost pain. A line that had fed Hellcats tried out refrigerators and found that rivets and Freon kept time together, if you asked them politely. Women who had learned to hold a torch with the confidence of a foreman came to the fork in the road the posters hadn't mentioned. Many kept working, many didn't, and the country argued about it forever after. The machinery of plenty, pre-war and wartime, found a new gear. In Japan, the lessons of logistics reversed themselves into recovery. The trains that still ran carried coal and then ideas. Ration cards thinned. Markets returned with caution and then laughter. Children learned the sound of a bell that meant fresh fish instead of air raid. The first supermarkets would come later, and when they did, they would look more like Tuesday than Triumph, which was the point. The quiet became a method again. What began as shock had become system. Start with 16 bombers on a deck that was too short. Continue through an atoll where a mistake about timing became a fleet on fire. Add a jungle runway that ate fuel and gave back futures. A convoy lane haunted into famine. A set of islands taken apart and put back together with checklists. In the end, surrender looked less like defeat than like a machine stopping because the parts that fed it had been accounted for and denied on schedule. Somewhere stateside, a machinist retired his night shift, rang a little brass bell above his shop door, and went fishing on a Tuesday because he trusted Wednesday to arrive without him babysitting it. Somewhere in Tokyo, a man who had once promised his son that water and pride were walls walked him past a newsstand full of schedules and said, softly, "Doors too." In both places, the same modest miracle held. People keeping small promises at scale until history had no choice but to change shape around them. If you need a single line to carry forward, take the one the war wrote in invisible ink across factories, flight decks, docks, and kitchens. Make daring possible. Make reliability inevitable. The noise fades. The choreography remains. And that's how the loudest century so far surrendered to the quiet.
They tried to put the century back on its shelves. America's first post-war miracle didn't look like a parade. It looked like paperwork. GI Bill forms slid across desks and turned foxholes into lecture halls, workshops, mortgages. A sergeant who had learned to coax life from an engine on a rain-black deck now learned calculus at a state college where the registrar kept time like a crew chief. A radio man with wrists shaped by Morse code opened a grocery and discovered that inventory was just another alphabet. Letters replaced by SKUs, sentences by shelves. Reliability, rehearsed at sea, learned a storefront voice. The country kept building the infrastructure that had won the war, but without the war in the sentence. Interstate highways made logistics a peacetime habit. Warehouses moved from railheads to cloverleaves. Forklifts became as American as front porches. Factory lines unlearned war the way a good dancer unlearns a roll, keeping the timing, changing the steps. A plant that had once coughed out Merlins or Wrights exhaled refrigerators and washing machines. A shipyard that had thrown Liberty hulls into water threw ferries and tankers into an economy that pretended to be calmer than it was. Across the Pacific, occupation worked best on a schedule. Railways reported tonnage like confessions. Coal allocations turned into warmth, ration cards into receipts, classrooms into futures. In Japan, the first self-service shops felt like small arguments with memory. Aisles, labels, a bell above the door that meant commerce, not warning. People learned to trust fluorescent light again. Tuesday returned and brought friends. The war's odd decks found their collectors. Doolittle men visited Chinese villages with scholarships and handshakes that arrived decades late and still mattered. A submariner gray at the temples filed a last report that was really an apology to every freighter he'd never seen. Tonnage is people at scale. A Marine from Henderson Field taught shop class and made his students oil the drill presses before they squealed. They rolled their eyes and oiled the Midway. Habits migrated, like veterans do, into places that had been waiting for them without knowing it. Far out on the water, another quiet revolution took shape. Containers. Steel boxes that did to freight what standard gauges had done to rails. Ports learned choreography with cranes. Ships grew into cities with keels. Customs became software. The world's argument about distance got new terms, not miles but hours, not borders but dwell times. The same discipline that had made a convoy breathe now made global supply chains yawn and stretch and show up for work. Because people are people, complacency tried to sneak in wearing a clipboard. Systems creaked, corners tempted, memory got tidy around the edges. Then a blackout somewhere, a strike, a storm, the kind of reminder that isn't polite, made the bell ring again. In a shop in Ohio and a market in Osaka, someone wiped the track, posted a note, limited to 2 per customer, and kept Tuesday alive. The choreography remembered itself. A last handful of men who had been young when Sirens taught cities new verbs sat with coffee that didn't need ration points and told their grandchildren surprisingly boring stories. Not because the war had been boring, but because what had beaten it stayed the same. Lists, drills, clocks, care. One of them kept a folded newspaper clipping in his wallet. The picture of 16 medium bombers lined up on a ship that had no business pretending to be their runway. He'd tap it and shrug. "We just did the steps," he'd say. The music took care of itself. And if you follow the bell back to where it began, camp guards, grocery aisles, a POW blinking under fluorescent certainty, you find that the loudest sentences of the age depended on a grammar most people overlook. Make promises small enough to keep. Keep enough of them that big things become unavoidable.
When oceans pretend to be walls, make doors. When fear pretends to be physics, rehearse until courage looks like competence. History moves on. The choreography stays. The rest of the century will argue loudly about ideology. The shelves will restock quietly. Or they won't, and you will know which argument is winning by whether Tuesday arrives on time.
The bell didn't retire. It changed keys. A new century learned old lessons the hard way. Storms that parked over coastlines, ships queued outside harbors, factories waiting on a missing 10-cent part like it was a king. Commentators said, unprecedented. The bell said, familiar. In a two-lane town and a megacity alike, the fix still began where it always had. A broom, a list, a posted hour you actually keep. The grandson, gray at the temples now, the shop steady as breath, watched his apprentice count boxes with a scanner and the same concentration a clerk once gave to ration stamps. Different tools, same grammar. When a truck was late, they didn't ask, who's to blame, before, what's the workaround? They split orders, called a cousin 2 counties over, set a 2 per customer limit with a smile and a reason. Nobody applauded. Everybody ate. That's how victory looks when it grows up. Every so often, someone brought in an artifact and set it on the counter the way you'd set down a question. A brass cart tag from 1944, a GI Bill diploma in a cracked frame, a photo of a runway on coral. The shop absorbed them without ceremony. The town didn't need relics to remember, it needed rhythms to continue. The bell did more history than any plaque. Once a year, on a morning chosen for no reason but habit, they wheeled the little display case into the doorway and told the story for anyone who had 15 minutes. Of POWs who saw a supermarket and understood a country. Of bombers that launched off 2 short decks and taught physics to behave. Of a jungle runway that refused to quit. Of ships that turned into hospitals because need said so. Of submarines that starved empires with patience. Of Tuesdays that outlasted slogans. People nodded. A few cried. Mostly, they asked for the practical chapter. What do we do next? The answer never changed. Make daring possible, make reliability inevitable. In practice, that meant more than nostalgia. It meant apprenticeships and backups, drills and spare parts, posted hours and posted whys. It meant cleaning the door track before it sticks. It meant teaching a kid that on time is kindness disguised as math. It meant refusing to be bored by the steps that turned courage into outcomes. Late one evening, the apprentice locked up and paused with the keys in his palm. Across the street, the co-op lights glowed like a memory you can shop in. Far away, somewhere over warm water and container lanes, the world was noisy again. Wars and rumors, shortages and speeches. Here, the only sound was the bell giving one small chime as the door seated perfectly in its frame. He smiled because he finally understood the old man's favorite line wasn't poetry at all. It was instructions. Keep Tuesday alive. That's why a bell above a door can outlast an empire. It rings for promises kept. If we can keep Tuesday alive, appointments held, shelves faced, doors sliding because someone cleaned the track yesterday, then everything loud has to negotiate with our quiet, and it usually loses. What's one boring step you'll turn into a daily promise, at home, at work, in your town, that keeps your Tuesday alive? Share it below. We'll pin the best ones and build a checklist together.